Well, good morning, North Campus. As you can see, I'm not physically present with you this morning, but my heart is with you, and honestly, it always is. I won't communicate this way often by video, and truthfully, I feel a little bit of PTSD as I'm doing this like it's COVID time again. I hope you don't feel that. And although others could do a talk on marriage very well, I wanted to finish this series with my own voice and my own stories, which no one else, of course, can do. For the past several weeks, we have been in a series where we've been talking about what it means to have a fulfilling and a lasting marriage. So far, we've said that a fulfilling and lasting marriage is based first and foremost on a commitment to Jesus Christ. That's the most important, and if we don't get that right, nothing else will be. We said that a fulfilling and a lasting marriage is based on a commitment to mutual submission. And before that, we said that it's based on a commitment to God's kind of love. This morning, I want to add one more crucial commitment to the list. And that is a fulfilling and lasting marriage should be based on a commitment to fidelity. Here's what I often say at wedding ceremonies. Fidelity means faithfulness and loyalty to one another, honesty and obedience to the commitment that you make to one another. In a practical sense, it means there's no human being that will be more important in your life than your spouse. There will be no one who will get more attention or effort or time than your husband or wife. Your best friend from this day forward should be the one to whom you're married, and this should be true not only in word, but also in deed. Fidelity means faithfulness to your relationship with your spouse above all other human relationships. It dawned on me this week, and honestly it's the first time it has, that in all three passages that we've studied so far, Genesis chapter 2, Matthew 19, and Ephesians 5, all three of those include this instruction. It says, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Now, the fact that it's mentioned in all three places suggests that it must be very significant and important. And the fact that the goal is for the husband and wife to become one flesh means that marriage is to be an exclusive, a special, uniquely different kind of relationship. Now, the most important relationship in our life early on is the connection we have with our parents. And it's a good thing. It's healthy for that bond to be strong as long as our mom and dad are alive. But when we get married, it's also important that our ultimate loyalty and dependence shifts from parents to spouse. Husbands and wives are to become one flesh by a man leaving and being united with his wife, leaving his mother and father and uniting with his wife. But it's too crowded for that to ever really happen if mother, father, mother-in-law, and father-in-law are so overly involved that a couple can't form their own identity and their own home. It's not about physical distance as much as it is about making sure that you have the emotional space to live your own life. Who do you talk to when you're sad or in trouble? Who do you take advice from in raising your children or navigating friend issues? Where do you go when you're angry and frustrated? Who's your best friend and your closest confidant? With whom do you share your deepest secrets? Other than God, the answer should be and begin with your husband or wife. That doesn't mean that you isolate yourself from your parents, not at all. Parents can be wonderful friends and give wise advice. It does mean your ultimate priority is your relationship with your spouse. So wives, When you have a big decision to make as a couple, don't bypass your husband and immediately ask your dad what to do. That's a trigger in marriage, a negative one. Husbands, don't immediately go to your mom for advice and support. That's another trigger. Instead, go to your wife first. One of the last things that you want to do in a fulfilling and lasting marriage is to start comparing your spouse to your mom or your dad. If your parents, they try and reassert the authority that they once had in their life, and they might not even realizing it because that's the position they had for so long, just kindly say no to them. Listen to their advice because it's likely good advice, and it almost always comes from the right place, but it's your life. You have to live it, and you as a couple need to own it. If your parents treat your spouse in a way that's hurtful and damaging, don't look the other way and don't make excuses for it. As uncomfortable as it might be, you're the best one to talk to your own mom and dad about a problem and to set boundaries. Protect your spouse from your parents' criticism. Do it respectfully, but protect your spouse. You know, in my family, I'm the youngest of 4 children. I was the baby, and I could say or almost do anything around my brother and 2 sisters, and nobody was really offended by it. They're just kind of like, well, that's Bruce, you know, and they look the other way. But it was not so much that way at first, at least with Nancy when we got married. So if there was any decision to be made that was at all contentious, like how long we would stay during holidays and with which family, it was always helpful if I was the one to communicate to my family that the decision we were making, that I made, that I owned that decision, rather than putting Nancy in the position of doing that. Again, your parents love you, and they loved you, they raised you, they cared for you, they sacrificed for you more than we can probably count. So in turn, God's word tells us to honor, to love, respect them, even care for them in their old age, but we aren't supposed to primarily depend on them when we get married. Our dependence is on our spouse. And just as it's true of our own marriage and friendships, don't require perfection from parents and in-laws. They're trying to figure things out too, so be gracious and try not to be overly sensitive, but be very confident it is God's will for you to become one flesh and to develop your own identity and your own family. And let me add to that this idea of fidelity in marriage even relates to your children. As important as they are, and how could we ever overstate that, your primary commitment is to your spouse. If you stay healthy, you may live with your husband or wife for 60 years or longer. Likely you'll be with your kids, living with them for 18 years or so rather. But ultimately, the very best thing that you can do for your children is to have a loving and a healthy marriage. Of course, there's always plenty of love to go around. So it's not a matter of limiting the amount of love that we have for our children or our parents. It's about making sure we don't allow the attention and care that our marriage deserves to be supplanted by anyone or anything else. It can happen to a marriage almost without even realizing it, and certainly without thinking about it, when you're raising children and working and you're so busy that if you aren't pretty intentional about it, you can start to neglect one another. I remember when Nancy and I were at South Padre Island, we had 3 little girls at one point, and I was pastoring a busy, growing, sometimes overwhelming church. We didn't have the problem at all of over-involved parents and in-laws because both our moms had died, but that also meant we didn't get any support from moms. And the rest of our family was 7 hours and 14 hours away. During most of that time, Nancy was pregnant or nursing, and we can remember during those years only 2 occasions where we spent a night or 2 away from the girls the first 6 or 7 years as parents. In fact, the first time we were away from one of our children for a night, we went to a marriage conference with members of our church. So the second time was a job interview in the Washington, D.C. area, not exactly a romantic getaway. I distinctly remember during those years, we had an anniversary, a wedding anniversary, and so we got a babysitter, and we were alone eating on our anniversary, and we were kind of looking at each other. It was a little bit awkward because we almost didn't know what to talk about because without being with the kids. And I was counseling a couple, it's been over 15 years ago, and you don't know them, and you couldn't find out who they were, and we were talking, and they were having terrible problems, really struggling. And at one point I just said to them as I listened, I said, when's the last time you guys spent some time alone and without the kids? And they said, well, what do you mean alone without the kids? I said, well, what I mean alone without the kids. When's the last time you went away for several days? They said, we can't. We have never done that. So you never done it since you've had the kids? Never. I said, when's the last time you'd gone to dinner? They said, you mean without the kids? I said, yes. When's the last time you went to a movie or to dinner or anything where just the 2 of you? And that couple could not remember. They could not remember a time when they had been alone together. They were having trouble in their marriage because they didn't know each other very well anymore. They were not becoming one flesh. Their relationship was all mixed up with no boundaries, and it was not very fulfilling, and it was at risk of not being very lasting. Did you know that the divorce rate for people over 50 has doubled since 1990, and researchers are predicting that gray divorce will triple by 2030? Here's one of the reasons, and I'm quoting this article I read. When they, speaking about a couple, experience the empty nest syndrome as adult children leave home, they wonder what they now have in common. The Japanese call the same issue of gray divorce, they call it retired husband syndrome. The divorce rate is so high for those over 50 because husbands and wives have neglected each other for children and work, and it's a mistake. A fulfilling and lasting marriage is based on a commitment to fidelity, which means faithfulness to make your husband or wife the most important human being in life. And you remember, as I say in wedding ceremonies, that's not just a thought, that's a commitment to actually make that a deed, to do what it takes to make your spouse number one in your life. And that leads to another aspect of fidelity, a very important one. A fulfilling and lasting marriage is also based on a commitment to emotional and sexual fidelity. You realize, don't you, if you don't, you need to, we all do, that no one enters a marriage with the intention of being unfaithful. But infidelity, sadly, is not uncommon, and it's the leading reason for divorce. 50% of the time sexual infidelity occurs, the marriage will not survive. Having said that, it means that 50% of the time the marriage can survive. So if your marriage has experienced sexual infidelity, there is still hope. Realistically, it's going to take about 2 years of emotional struggle, but you can get to the other side of it if you'll work at it. What I'm saying is, you can make it. Better, of course, though. Right? Much better to prevent sexual infidelity before it ever happens. So let's talk about how. The first thing is we need to recognize that sexual infidelity almost always happens or begins with emotional infidelity. In other words, it almost always starts with an inappropriate friendship. Dr. Carlfred Broderick writes, I'm convinced that more people get themselves into the pain of infidelity through concern and compassion than any base motive. The world is full of lonely, vulnerable people who are hungry for a sympathetic ear and a shoulder to cry on. In other words, most people don't ever intend to be unfaithful, but they unknowingly put themselves in a position where it can easily happen, and that's one reason it's so dangerous. Did you know that the number one place for an affair is the workplace, where it's easy for inappropriate friendships to develop? You can be friends with people of the opposite sex, but if your commitment of fidelity in marriage is going to be held in honor, you can't ever put yourself in a position where somebody other than your husband or wife is meeting your emotional needs. So how do you know if a friendship with someone of the opposite sex is out of bounds or it's gone too far? Here are some signs. Your spouse isn't meeting your need for attention, approval, and affection, and another person starts meeting your emotional needs. Like they may start complimenting you in a way that you really enjoy. You begin to talk about problems you're having with your spouse to someone else privately. You don't do anything that's overtly inappropriate, but you just flirt. You rationalize the relationship and become defensive and protective of it. You look forward to being with that person more than with your own mate. You hide, or you're deceptive about the relationship. You don't tell your spouse everything. A relationship with the opposite sex can be considered emotional infidelity anytime it becomes personal. It is infidelity when it's kept secret, or it's lied about. It violates rules that a couple has previously agreed upon, or involves behavior we wouldn't do if our husband or wife were present. And it might be surprising, but an emotional affair in some ways is as serious and as hurtful as a sexual affair. Now, if those signs that I mentioned, if that describes a relationship that you're currently in, run for your marriage. Because intentional or not, you're on an incredibly destructive path. Proverbs 6, verse 27 and 28 says, "Can a man scoop fire into his lap without his clothes being burned? Can a man or woman walk on hot coals without their feet being scorched?" The obvious answer is, of course not. No way, we can't. And here's the deal. There is not a single person in this building or listening online who's beyond being unfaithful if they put themselves in the wrong position for long enough. So, if we want to have a fulfilling and lasting marriage, we commit ourselves to emotional as well as sexual fidelity. Now, I'm going to mention this again at the end of this, but it's worthy of doing now. At some point, the time to have a conversation of some boundaries with friends of the opposite sex and those kind of things, and social media use, that the time to do that's, right away. That husbands and wives, you ought to sit down and you ought to just have that open conversation. Finally, a commitment to fidelity means we need to constantly unpack the baggage. Now, what in the world do I mean by that? Maybe it's not an accident that God's word says that we are to become one flesh. Becoming is a process, isn't it? And becoming lasts our whole marriage. You see, when we marry somebody, we're not just marrying that person, we're marrying that person's family history, we're marrying their expectations, realistic and unrealistic, we're marrying their personality, we're marrying their past experiences, and all the emotional baggage that they brought with them into the marriage. And of course, the same is true when they marry us. They're marrying all the emotional baggage that is a part of who we are. And if your relationship with your spouse is going to be fulfilling and it's going to be lasting, you have to do more than just have a ceremony and move in together. With God's help, you need to unpack the baggage. For instance, where did you learn how to be a husband or wife? Where did you learn what a man and a woman are supposed to be in a marriage? There are probably a number of places, but without question, the number one place was by watching your own mother and father. You know, most of the time when couples get married and they become frustrated because their spouse is not meeting their expectations, they never talked about that before they got married. In fact, they didn't know they had those expectations. So it just never came up while they were dating. No matter how much a couple loves each other, and no matter how committed they are to Christ, it's normal. I underlined that as I was writing this. It is normal for them to need to unpack the baggage after they get married. It's not unusual. It's not strange. In fact, it's required for a couple to be able to move forward in a healthy way. We bring all kinds of baggage with us into a marriage. When you add family history and the different expectations that come from it, things can get real interesting, especially early on in a marriage. My wife, Nancy, was the firstborn child in her family. By the way, I have permission to share all these stories, so you can relax about that. But Nancy was firstborn in her family. Nancy came from a fairly normal family where her dad helped around the house a lot. Maybe he even overfunctioned. I came from a family where my mother died when I was 7, and my very dominant alcoholic father remarried and divorced twice before I was 19. My family life was obviously not particularly functional or normal, but it was completely normal to me because that's all I knew. Because of my dad's alcoholism and his lack of spiritual leadership or involvement in church, there were just a lot of things. When I became a Christian, I decided I was not going to emulate. Even though I loved my father, I knew what I was not going to be as a husband. But here's the deal. I had no real example about what I was supposed to be, no positive example. Add to that birth order something else we bring with us in a marriage, and it matters a lot. I said Nancy was the firstborn child in her family. In fact, for 9 years, she was an only child. I, on the other hand, was the baby of the family with an older brother and 2 older sisters. With my mom's passing, there's hardly even any pictorial evidence that I existed as a child. Nancy's family and mine were very, very different. And it never occurred to us. I mean, it simply never occurred for us to talk about this before we got married, because it was never a problem while we were dating. But here's how it all went down. Birthdays, they were a big deal for her. Remember, she's an only child, and the world stopped on her birthday. She was treated like a queen by her parents and grandparents as the firstborn child, whose mother was also an only child. They would just shower gifts on her, and surprises and special activities and parties. On the other hand, I don't remember ever having a birthday party growing up. The closest thing I remember is my sister taking me and a friend to Sonic. And don't start thinking, we should do a birthday party for Bruce. No, that scares me to death. I don't want it. But I remember very distinctly being in the car with my dad as a 9 or 10-year-old, and I said to him, Dad, today's my birthday. And he said, well, blank, and said a cuss word. You can imagine. He'd forgotten all about it. You say that's just awful. Well, maybe it was, but honestly, it wasn't awful for me. I knew my dad loved me. And when I reminded him it was my birthday, he gave me $50, and that was a lot of money back then. So it was a good day for me. But it never occurred to Nancy and me to talk about birthdays and how we would handle them and what they meant to us when we were dating. And then we got married. We loved each other very much. We were both Christians and wanted to serve the Lord. We believed the Bible, but the Bible didn't address birthday situations very specifically. On the first birthday, her first birthday was just about a month after we were married. Can you begin to picture the train wreck that's coming? Even though she reminded me numerous times in advance her birthday was coming, which seemed kind of odd to me. I'm like, well, why does she keep saying this? I forgot about it. In fact, I was a part-time youth minister, and I scheduled a youth trip to Six Flags on her birthday. I didn't get her a card. I didn't get her a gift. I didn't surprise her. I just loved her with all my heart. And I expected her to know it, or I wouldn't have married her in the first place, right? You know what? We had some very, very different expectations about birthdays and a very strong disagreement. I told her, I said, look, we'll celebrate it on another day. I offered to buy her something at Six Flags. I mean, that's what would have happened in my past. It would have been normal for a birthday to be that way. But Nancy told me very clearly that another day was not her birthday. Her birthday was June the 19th. She wasn't interested in me buying her a gift from Six Flags, and she didn't care how much it cost. In fact, she was ticked. She had expected me, guys, if you can imagine this, she had expected me to have already gotten her a gift in advance and to have given it some thought in advance as well. Can you imagine that? Now, I loved her, but I couldn't figure out what her problem was. I mean, why was she so self-centered? I mean, the world doesn't revolve around you, is what I was thinking. She was so upset. I mean, I was afraid the kids in the youth group and the sponsors were going to figure it out. What was she thinking? And I'm sad to say, and I'm not joking about that, I'm very sad to say, we have a lot of stories like that I could tell you that would reflect the incompleteness that we both brought into the marriage. Both of us, but mine on a more acute level. And we just had a lot of baggage to unpack, which we have done. And so do most couples have a good deal of baggage to unpack as well. And when those inevitable issues come up in your marriage, and I promise you, if you've not married yet or you're early on in your marriage, I can promise you those kinds of issues are inevitable. They're going to come up. We have a number of options as husbands and wives. You know, we can run to our parents for emotional support. We can turn all our emotional energy toward a child, toward another friend, or toward a job, and we can become bitter and emotionally distant from our spouse. We can have an emotional or a sexual affair with someone and violate the fidelity that we committed to our husband or wife, and then live with the pain and the regret of doing that. But we have another option too. It is a much, much better option. We could recommit ourselves to becoming one flesh and unpack the baggage. You could have an affair in your own home with your own husband or wife. You know, I've counseled people who've gone through so much pain in their marriage because they've had a lot of trouble unpacking all of that baggage. And they're in so much pain, and they're right on the edge of the divorce because they've waited way too long to start trying to get some help. And I've just said to them, I'm not asking you to stay in the marriage that you have. What I'm asking you is to commit yourself to staying in the marriage that it can become. I mean, nobody wants you to live through this kind of pain and continue it. What you need is to become the marriage that God intended you to be. I'm asking you to stay in the marriage that can be. Now, how would we go about that? Well, that's obviously, that's a big subject. But let's mention a few things. First, Recommit yourself to Jesus and the commitment you made to him as you stood on the altar, not just to your husband or wife, but you made to him. Recommit yourself to loving one another with God's kind of love, even sometimes when they may not feel lovely. And it's great if you do it together because, truthfully, both of you are unlovely at times. Mutually submit to one another, as we talked about, by trying to find out what our needs of our spouse are. Again, we know our needs. We're so well aware of that. But to find out what our spouse's needs and to begin to love them by meeting those needs. Second, make an appointment to spend some time alone together to talk over breakfast or lunch or dinner. And you say, well, what do you mean alone? Like that other couple maybe. What I mean is alone, just the two of you without your kids. And spend some time together. You say, well, we're busy. Well, you better find a way to get alone some. And while you're alone, talk about your parents and your in-law relationships. Set up some ground rules if you need to, if that's been an issue. And there's something magical that happens is when you're alone in this time and you're not already angry, you can talk pretty sensibly about it. I mean, it's easy to Google. Do a little work about in-law relationships and talk about some ground rules you might set up. Another time, when you've made this appointment, you ought to do this once a week for sure. Talk about ground rules concerning friendships of the opposite sex and social media. How do you handle that? How can you, what can you expect of one another in those situations? If you don't talk about it in advance, sadly, you're likely to be talking about it a whole lot after. Another time, maybe talk about your family history. Actually look back at your family history and relationships and talk about some of the expectations you naturally had coming out of that kind of family life and that they had, and consider how, maybe husbands' expectations weren't completely normal and wives weren't completely normal either, and how could we form a family life that is a Christian family and have some realistic expectations from that. Read a book on marriage together. Nancy and I, early on, we were in seminary. We didn't even have children. We were so busy. She was working full-time. I was full-time in seminary. I was working part-time at a church, and we were super busy. And we were arguing too much. And so what we did is we just got a book. It was called a self-help guide to marriage or something by Bill and Carolyn Self. As I told you, I mentioned it earlier, the book's special to me, not because it was so great necessarily, but just because it wasn't about the book. It was about us sitting down at breakfast together. We both read a chapter a week, and we talked about that chapter, and it was really a wonderful experience for our marriage. Third, make an appointment to spend some time alone together with your spouse that there's no agenda except just to talk. You're not talking about anything specific, but just being alone together. So what that means is a movie doesn't count. Going out for a movie is not the kind of date night where you're getting to know each other better. Watching Netflix. Go out to eat maybe, and that can do it. Or how about go for a walk, even better. It takes about an hour to walk 3.5 miles. And if you want to reconnect, walk, and you'll be surprised. You get about 10 minutes into, when I get home from work, Nancy says, what'd you do at work? And I say, nothing. Well, tell me about this. And I was like, I don't really want to talk about it. When I go on a walk, it takes me about 10 minutes to wind down. And it's amazing how we just start to talk about all kinds of things because we have the time and we have no one around. I know that some of that's difficult whenever you have children and they're young children. Maybe make a deal to swap kids for an hour or two with another young couple in your small group. And not only will that time together talking be good for you emotionally, it's healthy for you as well. Finally, get some help. Go to a marriage counselor. If you need a recommendation, we can help you with that. Or go to a marriage conference. Most couples have times in their relationships where they get stuck. And if it happens in your marriage, it's not a sin. The sin is not getting some help when it's happening. It's amazing to me how in our professions, We get degrees, we get master's degrees, we get specialized training for whatever profession we're going in. Then in our profession, we're required to do continuing education, right? Because they expect us, our employer, to be growing, and we want to do the best we can in our profession. But when it comes to most of us in our relationship, the most important relationship in our life, which is our marriage, we just kind of buy a license and wing it, like we're supposed to know everything automatically, but the truth is we don't. A commitment to fidelity in marriage means that we commit to work as hard at becoming one flesh and being a good husband or a good wife as we do at being successful in our profession. And here's the thing I want to ask you. At the end of this series, would you renew that commitment to God and to your spouse, to becoming one flesh as He's called you to be?